Hello, I'm Craig Constantine. Welcome. This is the Podcaster Community Show, short conversations that are not just about podcasting because I like to take the scenic route. Our guest today is Elise Smith. Welcome, Elise.
Hey, Craig, I'm glad to be here.
So am I. I know you through, as a lot of people on the show, I know you through the podcasting course. And so we have like 10 minutes before we press record with these things. And I have like one eye on the clock and one eye on the guest. And we started going off on like boom mics and mic stands and technical, I'm going to say geeky stuff. I'm a self-outed geek. Um, and I'm wondering if you want to talk about the nuts and bolts of like how you create your show, like how'd you get to the title? How'd you get to the description? What was it like? Or do you want to just talk about like this is where you're going with the show? So it's like, yeah, I'll give you a choice. Do you want to do which way book? You want to do the how did you get to it, or what are you going to do with it?
Yeah, let's jump in on the nuts and bolts. I think one interesting thing I've learned doing the Akimbo workshop for podcasting is about myself is that I really am the biggest resistance comes from wanting to jump into the nuts and bolts. And so I've actually used this time to say, okay, I'm going to allow myself 20 minutes to pick a mic for my podcast, which was like a horrible thought to me. And then I'm like, I'm going to only use whatever they recommend. I'm not going to, because I'm a research nerd. But I would spend, if I allowed myself like 5 hours picking a mic, 10 hours picking where to do the recording. And so my goal here was just to try to do a podcast with the least amount of research. And it's been a really interesting experience into the tech.
Yeah. I often think I should tattoo the Pareto principle 80-20 on the inside of my
Yes.
eyelids, like,
Yes.
or on my retinas. So it's just overlaid on my universe. What's the simplest thing that could possibly work? Which is, there's a lot of deep wisdom, right? In avoiding, we often say podcasting is just, there's no field with rabbit holes. It's just all rabbit holes. Like every single bit of it is a hole.
I feel that. Yes.
And there's clearly an advantage to having people that are either traveling with you or like right in front of you, go, you can just step over that rabbit hole. Like just, grab any pair of headphones. It's fine. And the people who are really into audios or audiophiles just freaked out. Like, what do you mean? Like headphones are a thing. But I'm wondering if there is a piece of that tech or those rabbit holes that you enjoyed digging into.
I would say I've enjoyed the rabbit hole I've loved the most is about the how to interview. So learning about open-ended questions versus yes and no. A tip I really loved from Tim Ferriss was picking a gold nugget story for the beginning that they've already told 9 or 10 times so that they feel super comfortable right at the beginning, and then transitioning to content that you haven't heard them say. So I've used that quite a bit. And then the other rabbit hole I did is for my first few podcasts, I was so nervous about the beginning because it always feels so awkward, those first 4 or 5 minutes. And so I just listened to the beginning of like 100 podcasts, and I realized all of them, Joe Rogan, Brene Brown, Dax Shepard, they're all awkward. I mean, except for obviously the highly produced ones, but the ones that are just interview, they're all terribly awkward in the first 4 or 5 minutes. And that made me feel much more peace going into it. I was just like, embrace the awkwardness. I even tell some of the guests, it'll probably be awkward for like 4 or 5 minutes. Embrace it.
There's definitely, I really, not that I don't want to say, I'm always careful. How can we spin this positively? I don't like doing podcasts over the internet. This is not my idea of the right way to do this. So this is like strike one right out of the gate is, let's watch, pixelated versions of each other at 3 frames per second. Well, I think that we should, we're like ripping out all of the stuff that as human beings, we are hardwired for micro expressions. Oh, that's all gone in video at low frame rate. We're hardwired for timing and all these nuances. So when you mention, all of the conversations, or not everyone, I know what you mean. A lot of them, they're awkward when they start. It's like, yeah. And we're trying to do this, we who are trying to do these conversations. And in addition to that, we're trying to do it through technology, which makes it even harder. So yeah, when I kind of realized like, all right, this is artificially difficult, so it's going to be difficult. I think that's a really good point that you make about, yeah, in a way, this sucks.
And on top of that, I found my podcast is called How to Disappoint Your Mom. And it stemmed from the fact that I realized a lot of the turning points in my life, I was thinking much more about what will they think about me.
Hmm.
And it left little room for what I was thinking about the decision myself. And so I've talked to people about these big turning points they've had in their life where they've had to face some type of social rejection from their family or their friends. And two of those people, one was a divorce that happened recently, and the other one was uh, being beat by her mom in her childhood and being sexually assaulted by her father. And so, just the weight of kind of getting into that in the first 10 minutes of the podcast is something that I don't take lightly and has really been a learning curve for me to figure out how to approach those subjects in a way that people feel comfortable about. And a lot of that happens before you hit record. I found is figuring out how to, like, you actually, this was a masterclass from you, just saying we can delete this, nothing has to go out, all of those sorts of things. You see their shoulders kind of drop a little bit every time you say that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I appreciate your compliment, but I think um, you're really onto something with the point you make. And my opinion is a lot of it comes from intention. If not that I started doing podcasting with the wrong intention, but when I began to actually go, oh, it turned out looking backwards that my default intention worked. I happen to be a stupidly curious, ridiculously passionate. Oh my God, if you don't like talking to Craig, you're not hooked up right. That may not be true for everybody, but most people love it. But I realized in hindsight that I hadn't done that on purpose. That just worked out that way. And when I started to be more intentional about like the things that you're describing, like setting tone, when I started to really dig into that, I found that stuff is just as interesting to me as is the what the conversation accomplishes. So I've had conversations where guests work through things, we go to the dark place, and at the very end, I'm like, not right as soon as I hit stop, and I'm like, "Are you okay with that? Do you want to listen to it?" Because I'm not 100% sure that the intention of let's, proverbially us who do this, let's create a safe space, let's make the guests feel comfortable. I'm not sure that intention is necessarily going to give us something that should be heard by anybody else. It certainly should be the thing we're doing. We should be coming from that intention. But it's interesting when you start, like, it's kind of like the more you do it, the better you get at it. Like, and then you're like, have to make sure we're using these skills for good. Like, don't go around manipulating people into saying things they didn't want to say in the first place. So you're definitely onto something there.
Yes, I think my wife and I co-own an editing business, and we work with authors before they send book to publication. And
What's it called?
it's called the Timbre Co. Timbre, thetamberco.com. And
Because they warned you I wouldn't let you get away with skipping the
yes,
names of things.
yes. Yeah, I forgot about that. But I think I've just seen part of what made me want to start the podcast was I've worked with all these authors who go through this process, and some of them, only 40 or 50 people read their book at the end of the process. But it is still, I call it a deathbed project because this is what they talk about it in the same way they'll talk about their wedding or having kids or designing like a dream home or living overseas. It is something they will remember the rest of their life. That is such a fulfilling experience. And we've actually had clients pass away from cancer who email us in their last 3 or 4 months remembering the process of writing the book and what it meant to them. And I realized that the podcast is a lower resistance, easier way for people to explore their life stories, to take that deep dive without all that it takes to put out a book. And that's what I've really enjoyed about it, is creating that experience, but it only takes 2 hours for people instead of the hundreds that a book takes.
I'm torn between saying, so I'll just say it. I would say how far we can go without me actually asking you a question. Well, but what I'm fascinated about, I'm not, I'm going to say I'm not fascinated about writing a book. People keep saying I should write. I'm like, no, I really don't want to do it because I think I understand this is going to take a while. This is going to require a bunch of work. And I'm not a particularly fluent writer. Like, I mean, I can sit down and write a blog post, but to write something longer or to carry a train of thought, I'm like, this is going to be hard. But I'm interested in your thoughts on, you mentioned that, say a 2 hour podcast, or in this case, a half hour, recording call, is it lower barrier? It's easier for people to engage with that, like the guest on the show or the person whose story is being told in the book or whose information is being conveyed. And I think you're right about, because the time commitment is so much less. But I'm also wondering, doesn't it also scare them more? Like, I've had guests who are accomplished authors, and when I try to get them on a call for a half hour, I'm going to press the big red button. They're just like, no, well, I don't want to, because they feel like because it's so much more intimate. Like, if you get a human on a podcast as a guest versus a human who wrote a book, the book is much further from the person than the podcast is. So I'm just wondering if you've also, since you've clearly picked apart this idea about one being more approachable, and I agree with you, um, but how do we deal with the fact that, yeah, but podcasting is really intimate, way more intimate than someone writing a book and handing it, to somebody else to read?
I think the advantage of podcasting is, even if you self-publish a book, typically it'll still take a minimum of a year from the time that you start to write it to the time that it's out there. So you're not really getting that live take. You're not getting quite what it felt like for them right in the experience. And my third guest, her divorce was finalized on a Tuesday, and we had our podcast that Friday. And the entire process happened in less than a year. So a year ago, she knew she was in an emotionally abusive relationship with a chronic liar, but divorce wasn't even on the table
Had no
because she
path
came
forward, right?
from a conservative Christian background where the only reason to divorce was infidelity or someone becoming an atheist. And she was in such a raw place. She was in a safe place. Like, she was ready to share, but it was still the advantage of the podcast I found was if she wrote a book in 3 years, it would not be the same experience as listening to her on the podcast 72 hours after her divorce goes through.
Right.
And I was going to say, regarding you saying whether or not you have to be a writer to write a book, I found if you're writing about the right topic that is crunchy enough, meaning it's really relatable and no one else has written about it, you don't have to be Hemingway to have a good book. It just has to be a topic people really care about that hasn't been touched on in that way before. I'm not pitching you on a book because you really have to.
That's a fair point. My first thought was, oh, good, I don't want to be Hemingway because I don't want to be an alcoholic. But setting that aside, that's a good point about the proximity. There can be opportunities where having the guest, recording the experience with the guest close to the thing that we're talking about, that you couldn't even do that in a book, let alone I would be a really good writer. And I know that I've read books where it can come through in writing. But yeah, that's also another good point that I hadn't really considered about the ability to do it quickly, do it soon in time. And I'm off running a little mental tangent about, I do this particular show. I don't know if you recall or if you noticed, when you go to schedule to be a guest on here, you can't go more than 7 days in the future. And I actually get surprisingly, I'm not asking for people listening to start, I get surprisingly little pushback on that. And I do get people who go, oh, could we do this in May, or 6 weeks out or something? And then I make a note and I circle back. But it, first of all, prevents people from Swiss cheesing my calendar 6 weeks out. But it also means that and this is what made me think of this when we were talking about that proximity idea, is it also means that there's very little time between when I say, hey, would you like to? And you say, hey, I think so. And then you click the button, you'll be in my schedule within a few days. And I find that that makes a difference because people come to the call and I can't say everybody, I don't know for sure, but it seems like they feel that the call is a continuation of the conversation that we started in the guest, in the outreach letter. So when I DM'd you inside the platform where the course is happening, now I'm like, connect to people before they disappear. And I was like, hey, would you like to do the thing? And you're like, yeah, I guess so. And I send you the link and you click and it's like, I don't know, I think I did that like maybe on Monday or Sunday or something, maybe Friday. And here we are on Wednesday. So I think your point about the proximity could also be useful to people who are out there trying to imagine, how do I get guests? And I think maybe trying to play into let's have a conversation or an interview that is a continuation of this discussion that I would like to start today. I hadn't really thought about, I don't want to say weaponizing, but like making that directly actionable. So that's a good point that you make about the proximity. Again, no question. Interview yourself.
Well,
right?
yeah, sure, I can. I'll say I found the getting guests part to be the most difficult part of the show for me because I'm looking for specific guests who have gone through some type of turning point and experienced social rejection and come through in a way that they're proud of the decision or how they handled it or something. So not a point that they were forced through. And one thing I came to yesterday is I wanted to do weekly podcasts because it's just like the way I wanted to do it. And then
OCD much?
Yes. And I realized that just having that idea was such a huge blocker toward putting my podcast out because then I have to have 4 or 5 podcasts ready to go just to have that lead time. And it was really blocking my momentum. So I've started to ask myself the question, is having this parameter giving me more momentum or less momentum? And I realized weekly podcast, less momentum, and a variety of other things were less momentum. So I've started paring back on some of the frameworks I had around the podcast.
Well, what are things that you're leaning into that do give you momentum?
I think still keeping the long podcast format because my interviews have averaged an hour and 45 minutes or 2 hours. And it takes a lot more time than somebody who's doing an hour. I mean, it's double the work for in the post-production and harder to land guests. But I found a lot of that unwinding for the guest. I mean, there's so much gold in the podcast that I've done after the hour, 20 hour, 30 mark. I mean, there's so much, there's in the beginning too. It's not like it takes that long to get there, but I find the more they get comfortable, we get past the rote answers. It's hard to have 2 hours of rote answers.
Unless you're a politician, but yes.
I have had one politician that I've thought about asking on, but I can't quite do it yet. There's so much. Have you had politicians on any of your podcasts?
I don't think so. I actually tried to interview, this is a long story and I'm not going to tell it, but I tried to interview the mayor of a town that is a suburb of Paris. So a fairly well-known actual real politician in the office. And it didn't go well because first of all, it's language barrier and they wanted all the questions up front. I'm like, oh yeah, no, not that kind of interview. So I think that I didn't have the right, I needed a completely different set of skills to approach that kind of person. So I was out of the gate on the wrong foot. But no, I've never had any actual real politicians.
I've heard it can be disenchanting.
Yeah, I could see that. The same thing can happen though if I've had guests where it took us a long time to get the energy to go or to click. I call it the entry point. Like this is where the thing is actually going to start when it goes out. For my other projects, I do long form stuff. And sometimes I think the record is I spent 20 minutes of tape. I mean, it's all digital, but I think I spent 20 minutes of tape talking to somebody who I knew, like I knew this person fairly well from, training together a whole 9 yards. And it was like, took me 20 minutes until I finally found the right thread to pull on that invited that person to to just like jump on it, like, whoa, I'm in, and they were for the whole part before that, they were just kind of like, this is interesting. I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt. Not sure where you're going with this, Craig. So, yeah.
It's interesting you say that about it being someone that you know, because in the podcasting workshop, they recommend you have people you know really well at the beginning, and then you transition to people that you maybe don't know as less. I've found it to be the opposite, which is I found it much easier to interview someone I barely know, much harder to interview someone I know really, really well. Because the
That's deep
person
wisdom.
yes. So I don't know that I would recommend people start that way. And I haven't had my wife on yet, even though I want to talk through our coming out experience 6 years ago. I know that I can't quite see it yet from where I can figure out what the listener needs to hear. And even having one guest on that I knew intimately well, talk 2 or 3 times a week, very hard to not think about what they are feeling. Whereas the guests that I don't know, I'm just thinking about the listener and making them feel safe, but not really knowing it doesn't have all those roadblocks.
I'm watching our time tick away. I have a chapter in my book that I haven't written about why interviewing people you know really well is exceedingly difficult. But we'll leave it at that for today. Maybe we'll do another episode. you can be the first repeat guest. Schedule in for Thursday or Friday. I'm not kidding. And we should really talk about that, about what it is about people that you know really well versus don't well. I have lots to say about that. I'm not saying I have all the answers, but we could talk about that for another 20
I'd
minutes.
like to pick your brain on it.
But I think this is a good place to stop for this episode for today, for our first opportunity to get a chance to sit down and talk. It was a distinct pleasure. And thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Craig. It's been great.